Alrighty, history fans, welcome to another exciting lecture in the course. And here today we turn our attention to the Reconstruction period, the period after the Civil War. It is a period from 1865, when the U.S. Civil War ends, until 1877. So a 12-year time period where the nation is facing the next great question: how do we put the nation back together after 11 states seceded from the Union, after a ruinous Civil War that took the lives of 620,000 people? How do you reconstruct a nation that deconstructed over the issue of slavery and devolved into a civil war? That is the challenge facing the nation in 1865 when the Reconstruction period ends. We turn our attention now to how that question was addressed, the question of how to reconstruct the nation in the period after the Civil War. Our focus here today is the Reconstruction era and the process by which America attempts to reconstruct the nation in this fraught and important time period. One of the hazards of revealing to strangers at dinner parties and social functions that you teach history for a living is that I'm often greeted with the following question: if you could go back in time to any moment, when would it be? When people ask me that question, they're always disappointed in my answer, because my answer is, I don't want to go back in time. No thanks, okay? The best time to be alive is today, in the 21st century. I like drive-thrus. I like air conditioning. I like high thread counts. I am not anxious to go back to the 19th century, wipe my ass with a leaf, and get diphtheria. No thank you, okay? But if forced to go back in time, perhaps the most fascinating month ever in American history, April of 1865, when our story here today begins. In April of 1865, the Civil War comes to an end when the South surrenders. And so, in that month, that long, ruinous, arduous Civil War comes to an end. Also, in this month of April of 1865, when Reconstruction begins and the Civil War ends, as a result of the South's defeat, slavery would be abolished. The war did not begin to end slavery, but it became, ultimately, an effort to do so. And that's why, in many ways, the Civil War is a second American Revolution, because it accomplished what had failed to be accomplished after the end of the American Revolution of the 1770s. It ended slavery. It ended the most powerful, profitable slave regime in human history. In April of 1865, the Civil War ends, and with the South's defeat, slavery ends. The most powerful, profitable slave regime in human history is no more. Something that, as we learned about in this class, had been part of America's origins. Remember, the first slaves arrived before the Pilgrims arrived. That ends in April of 1865. Something had been part of our origins, a slave system that had developed over 200 years, that was formative and central to American history, ends in this fateful month of April of 1865. As a result of that, 4 million human beings would now be emancipated. 4 million people were now to be forever free. 4 million human beings who were born into that system of slavery, who had no reasonable expectation of doing anything other than die a slave, would now be granted their freedom. Their parents had been enslaved. Their grandparents had been enslaved. They had been born into that system of bondage that had been around for over 200 years, and yet they lived through this fateful and remarkable moment and emerged as the first emancipated class in American history. So in April of 1865, when the Civil War ends, Reconstruction begins. When our story here today in this lecture, Reconstruction, is just beginning. In this fateful month of April of 1865, arguably the most fascinating, portentous, and important month in American history, Civil War ends, slavery is abolished, and 4 million human beings are emancipated. You'd be hard-pressed to name any other moment in American history so significant, so fraught with meaning. And if that's not enough, also in April of 1865, a few days after these events, a few days after the South's surrender, the country would endure its first, and sadly not last, presidential assassination when John Wilkes Booth, a white supremacist and pro-slavery sympathizer, will shoot and kill Abraham Lincoln. Booth could not accept now living in an America where slavery had been abolished. He blamed Lincoln, and he assassinated Lincoln accordingly. Lincoln died in April of 1865 on Good Friday, the day that Christians acknowledge and commemorate the death of Christ, making Lincoln instantly a martyr, a man who is seen to have died for our sins, the sins of slavery. So that's the moment where we begin our story here today of Reconstruction, that fateful month of April of 1865 where the Civil War ends and the next moment in American history begins, what some describe as the war after the war, this Reconstruction period. As we pull back the curtain on our story here today of Reconstruction, there are 4 different players who we'll see in this drama, in the story of Reconstruction, that all have different visions, different hopes for what Reconstruction could mean. So we begin our story of Reconstruction, and on stage, as we draw back the curtain in this fateful moment, this fateful month of April of 1865, there are 4 players on stage, all of whom will have different visions for what Reconstruction could mean. With Reconstruction, we were hitting the reset button. We were reimagining this nation for the first time as a post-slavery nation. And so everything was in flux. Everything was in play. And in the debate that will erupt regarding how to reconstruct the nation as we hit the reset button, 4 different players will emerge with different visions, hopes for what America could now be as a post-slavery nation. The first of the 4 players, those 4 million people who were emancipated in April of 1865 with the end of the Civil War, 4 million human beings who were born into slavery, who had no reasonable expectation of doing anything other than die a slave, who emerge here as free individuals. They had a hope. They had an aspiration for what America could now be as they emerged into freedom. It's known as the Freedmen Vision. Now, of course, that's a misnomer to some extent because half of these people were women, but the former slaves were known as the freedmen collectively, and they had a vision, a hope for emancipation known as the Freedmen Vision. What was the Freedmen Vision? 40 acres and a mule. They hoped to receive land as a form of compensation for their lifetime of toil, the toil that made America so prosperous and wealthy. Remember, America was born out of the greatest theft in human history, stealing the wealth of millions of people for centuries with the institution of slavery. And so 40 acres of land would offer an inadequate but some form of compensation for that lifetime of toil. But much more importantly, 40 acres of land represented freedom, opportunity, because as we've learned in this class from the very beginning in American history, land was associated with freedom, opportunity, a chance to be master of one's own fate. And so former slaves wanted 40 acres of land. They wanted land and a way to work it as a foundation, a beginning to truly be free. Own land, chart your own course. Own land, be master of your fate, master of your destiny. These 40 acres of land were originally part of a wartime strategy employed by General George Tecumseh Sherman, who made a sweep through the Deep South during the Civil War and emancipated every slave that he encountered and gave those freed slaves 40 acres of land. Sherman did this as a wartime strategy, an effort to undermine the South, to urge Southerners to see a world turned upside down right there in their midst, to invert that racial hierarchy, take land, power, and privilege from whites and give it to freed, emancipated slaves. Former slaves hoped that after the war, that wartime strategy would now become a template for Reconstruction, where every emancipated slave would receive those 40 acres of land. This was important to former slaves because it would truly grant them a sense of freedom, control over their lives that they had been actively denied under slavery. 40 acres of land, a way to work it, would provide them a way to truly be free. They are emerging out of slavery with nothing, no money, No education, few skills other than farming. What they wanted was 40 acres of land so that they would have a chance to truly be free. Emerging out of slavery with nothing, this land would give them a chance to be in charge of their lives. It would be as if you landed from another planet here in Southern California in 2020 without a penny to your name. You'd instantly ask for a laptop, Honda Civic, and a condo, just the basics to get you started, just the basics to give you a fighting chance in the 21st century economy. Well, that's the case here, where former slaves are emerging as free and independent, but with nothing. What they wanted was a foundation, a beginning, a means to truly be free, economic opportunity. That's what makes you free. Not just no longer being a slave, but the economic opportunity that would come from land ownership and the way in which it offered the promise of being truly in charge of one's destiny. So the first player in our story, former slaves, the freedmen, 4 million human beings who improbably emerge now as independent, free, and what they wanted, a vision, a hope, was to truly be free in the most meaningful way. Economic freedom, economic opportunity, the chance to own land and be master of one's fate. Sadly, tragically, they would never realize that freedman vision, thanks to the second player in our story, ex-Confederates. White Southerners who had supported the Confederacy, risen up in rebellion against this nation, taken up arms, and fought a ruinous civil war in the effort to preserve and extend slavery. They lost in that effort, and so for them, the great hope of Reconstruction is to win the peace. That was the rallying cry, the slogan of ex-Confederates. Kind of a strange concept here. The idea was, well, we lost the war, but we can still win the peace. Meaning finesse, work to our advantage the peace process to hold on to what we hold dear. What did that mean in real terms? Well, win the peace meant preserving that Southern way of life that kept blacks and whites separate. Slavery did a great job of that. As we learned about slavery in this class, slavery was a race-based society where from the very beginning there were these divides in terms of rights, power, and privileges based on race. Well, slavery is no more in April of 1865. It's abolished. When the peace was about preserving what slavery allowed for in a now post-slavery South, post-slavery America. When I say keeping blacks and whites separate, I don't just mean physically separate, though that's important, and it will lead to Jim Crow America, segregation, 100 years after the Civil War, where social space in American life is segregated, keeping blacks and whites separate. But more than that, keeping blacks and whites separate meant into two different categories, where rights, power, and privilege are the exclusive domain of whites only. Slavery, again, was defined by such a process. The hope of win the peace is to preserve that now in a post-slavery America. Preserve rights, power, and privileges, voting rights, private property rights, and rights over one's own body, as for whites only, and deny voting rights, private property rights, rights over one's own body to African Americans. That was the goal of win the peace. Those 40 acres of land that were doled out to some slaves emancipated by George Tecumseh Sherman would be repossessed and restored to these people, ex-Confederates, traitors to this nation. People had risen up in rebellion against this nation. That represents the goal here of Win the Peace, restoring private property rights and the power and privilege that went along with it. So the second player in our story are the ex-Confederates, white Southerners who rose up in rebellion, who have this goal, win the peace. Third player in our story, moderate Northerners. And you don't have to work too hard to understand this group, just look at their name. They are Northerners who are, anyone want to guess? Yeah, right, moderate. Moderate in the sense that they're very conciliatory towards the South. They didn't want to punish the South too much. They didn't want to involve the nation in a long and difficult struggle of racial reckoning and remaking. These are the people we talked about in our recent lecture on the road to the Civil War. Northerners who are opposed not to slavery itself, but the extension of slavery in the West, and were so because of economic reasons. The point I made in that lecture many times was that the vast majority of Northerners are not abolitionists. Abolitionists were a small, radical group who did believe in abolishing slavery everywhere and did also believe in racial equality, ending slavery and remaking America into a nation where all are equal. Well, that's a fringe and radical point of view. Instead, the majority opinion of white Northerners before, during, and now after the Civil War is one more concerned with economic opportunity that would come with the end of slavery. These were people that, again, we described who, in the 1850s, rallied around the Republican Party with its message, slavery goes no further. They weren't abolitionists. They weren't people who sought to abolish slavery, and they certainly weren't advocates for racial equality. They were always concerned with economic opportunity. And now, with slavery abolished, they sought to enjoy the fruits of their victory. The West would now be forever closed to slavery. And so a wage economy, a competitive wage economy would prevail in the West. Now that land out west is available to small-scale farmers who want to own land and cultivate that land for profit. And so the vast majority of Northerners, before and during and now after the Civil War, were not interested in racial justice, racial remaking. They certainly weren't interested in the cause of racial equality. They had always been motivated by economic interests. And now, with victory, with slavery abolished, they sought to enjoy the economic opportunities that came with the end of slavery. And as a result, they tended to be very conciliatory towards the South. They wanted to welcome in these 11 states that seceded with as little friction and demands as possible. They weren't interested in a protracted effort to remake the South, to, again, offer rights and opportunities to the emancipated African Americans. They were interested in reconciliation, a quick, clean process so they could enjoy the fruits of their victory, march westward, kill Indians, and build railroads. And they had an ally in the White House in Andrew Johnson. When Lincoln is assassinated in that fateful month of April of 1865, his vice president, Andrew Johnson, became president. Andrew Johnson was a Southerner, former senator and governor of Tennessee, and a former slave owner. Andrew Johnson was a white supremacist. He believed in all the values we talked about of that slave society. He had owned slaves himself. And now he is thrust into this position as leader of this nation as we begin the process of Reconstruction. Oh, the consequences of Lincoln's assassination. When Lincoln is killed by that white supremacist, John Wilkes Booth, we're robbed of what could have been if Lincoln had survived and led this nation. Instead, we would be led by Andrew Johnson. Johnson was a Southerner, former slave owner, but he always remained loyal to the Union. He never supported secession. He's the only senator from a seceding state to remain in Washington and remain loyal to the Union. And that's why Lincoln tapped him as his running mate in 1864. He represented the loyal Southerner. When Lincoln taps Johnson as his vice president, he has no crystal ball. He has no ability to foresee that he will be assassinated and Johnson will be thrust into this position. But that's exactly what happens. Because of Johnson now as president, he could steer Reconstruction in the way that he had hoped. And he takes a very conciliatory approach towards the South. He welcomes these 11 states in. He restores voting and private property rights to, again, traitors, ex-Confederates, those who had risen up in rebellion against this nation. He's the guy who takes those 40 acres who had been doled out by General George Tecumseh Sherman and restores them to ex-Confederates. Now, you might chalk that up to him being Andrew Johnson, former slave owner, white supremacist, but that misses the point. When Andrew Johnson does this, when he takes this very conciliatory approach towards the South, he's acting in concert with, in agreement with, the majority of Northerners who are also inclined to take a very conciliatory role. So the third player in our story, the largest in number, the most numerous, and that matters in a nation where the weight of numbers often hold sway, were Northerners who took this very conciliatory approach, moderate Northerners, those who were not inclined towards a racial reckoning, a remaking of the nation where blacks and whites would be equal. But it will be the fourth player in our story who will prove to be the most consequential in the first phase of Reconstruction. Fourth player in our story, actually the smallest, fewest in number of all these groups, but as we'll see here, they would be ultimately the most consequential in the first phase of Reconstruction. They are the radical Republicans. These are abolitionists. These are men who had been, in some cases, lifelong advocates for abolishing slavery and creating a new America, reborn, resurrected, where blacks and whites are equal. They had accomplished the first of those goals, and probably, even before the Civil War ends, the 13th Amendment would abolish slavery. When the South surrenders, they're accepting that that amendment is already part of the Constitution and slavery is abolished. Now the radical Republicans turn their eyes to the second goal. Once slavery is abolished, let's remake America, resurrect America into a nation where all are equal. Now, the Republican Party, as we described in our most recent lecture on the road to the Civil War, was not an abolitionist party. When Lincoln runs in 1860 and becomes the very first Republican elected, he absolutely ran on a platform that said, I'm not here to end slavery. I'm not an abolitionist. Lincoln had denounced abolitionism for most of his career. But within the Republican Party, there were some radicals, people like Charles Sumner and Thaddeus Stevens, who were abolitionists, who hoped to steer their party towards their effort. Those are the radical Republicans, a small group of congressmen and senators who wanted to seize this moment of a remaking of the nation, of Reconstruction, and remake this nation in a way that fulfilled its long-deferred dream of equality and freedom for all. And of the four players in our story here, as we'll see in just a moment, it will be the radical Republicans, a small group of senators and congressmen, true abolitionist-minded people, true advocates for a radical remaking, who will seize control of Reconstruction and steer the nation towards that vision of equality and freedom for all through the employ of passion, emotion. How was this small group of senators and congressmen, the radical Republicans, able to take control of America in this fateful moment of Reconstruction? Well, they agitated passion and emotion. The radical Republicans were led by this man, Thaddeus Stevens, who would take to the floor of the U.S. House and give passionate, thunderous speeches in which he denounced the Confederacy, denounced these southern states for bringing this horror and misery to this nation. He asked questions like, who's responsible for 620,000 dead Americans? The South did this, and they must pay. Who's responsible for the loss of your son, your daughter, your wife, your husband? The South did this, and they must pay. So Stevens, Charles Sumner, the radical Republicans were again lifelong abolitionists. They had made a life, a career out of advocating for ending slavery and creating a new America where blacks and whites were equal. And as a result, they are very skilled, very adroit at oration, at argumentation. They had for their lifetime advocated a very controversial and radical point of view. And when you are advocating for a radical change, you better get really good at making that argument. So they were persuasive, passionate speakers. They were willing to reopen the raw wounds of the Civil War, demand justice, demand change. When Johnson comes in and looks like he is leaving the South off the hook, welcoming them in with no justice, no retribution, here comes Stevens, here come the radical Republicans, and they demand justice, they demand change, they demand that the South own up to their defeat. And so the radical Republicans whipped up frenzy, emotion. They got people angry. They demanded justice. And in doing so, they converted moderate senators and congressmen into radicals. If Lincoln died on Good Friday, if he's a martyr, a Christ-like figure that died for our sins, where's the redemption? Where's the resurrection? And as a result of this, the radical Republicans built a coalition, folding moderates into their movement, and with it came a series of amendments passed by these radical Republicans that forever changed America in this moment and continues to change America even now in the 21st century. There was the 13th Amendment, ratified in early 1865, even before the South surrendered. 13th Amendment ended slavery. It's a very short amendment, but a profound one, because it ended the most powerful, profitable slave regime in human history. It ended something that had been part of American history since 1619. That ends with the 13th Amendment. What had once seemed like an impossible, improbable vision advanced by abolitionists in the 1830s and 1840s when they sought to end slavery, sought to end the most powerful, profitable slave regime in human history, that quixotic, impossible dream came true in 1865 with the ratification of the 13th Amendment. Then in 1868, the Radical Republicans were able to ratify the 14th Amendment, which is really their crown jewel and their greatest accomplishment. It is the most important amendment in the Constitution since the Bill of Rights, maybe the most important amendment of all. 14th Amendment says two key crucial things. One, everyone born in this country is a citizen. When slaves were emancipated, they were no longer slaves, but what was their status? They're not slaves, but who are they? 14th Amendment answered that question. They are citizens of this nation. The 14th Amendment says anyone born in this country is a citizen. What this did was it made 4 million human beings who were born into slavery, who were treated as not even human, let alone citizens, it made them citizens of this nation. It turned former slaves into citizens, and in doing so, ended race-based citizenship. Prior to the 14th Amendment, the only people who could become citizens of this nation, white people. It says that very clearly, very emphatically in our very first immigration law passed in 1790. That immigration law passed in 1790 says the only people who could ever become citizens, white persons. 14th Amendment ended race-based citizenship. It said anyone born in this country, including the emancipated slaves, are citizens of this nation. It turned former slaves who had been treated as property into citizens of this nation. It ended race-based citizenship. If American history is in part a question about who is an American, who is a citizen, 14th Amendment forever changed that by now allowing for non-whites to be citizens of this nation. That's one way the 14th Amendment is still very crucial and important now in the 21st century, because today it gets wrapped up in the immigration debate. Anyone born in this country is a citizen regardless of the status of your parents. It's birthright citizenship, and as we've learned, our current president and many of his allies don't like that. And they actually want to overturn the 14th Amendment because, again, all children born in this country are citizens. The Radical Republicans realized that this would have implications beyond just the status of former slaves to things like immigration, but they insisted on one standard. You can only have one definition of citizenship. You cannot have a nation where some are citizens or some kind of, but kind of not are citizens. That would lead to a racial hierarchy. That would lead to a situation where you had people in this country who were actively denied rights. 14th Amendment sets one standard for all. Anyone born here is a citizen. Radical because it turned former slaves into citizens of this nation. But the 14th Amendment also says something else, very key, very crucial. 14th Amendment says all citizens of this nation, that now includes former slaves, are guaranteed, quote, equal protection of law. What the 14th Amendment did, in addition to turning former slaves into citizens, it guaranteed all citizens of this nation equal protection of law. Now, ostensibly, there's no legal distinction between former slaves and the men who once owned them. What was the goal of abolitionism? Not just ending slavery, but creating a new America where blacks and whites are equal. That was accomplished, at least under law, in the 14th Amendment. 14th Amendment, radical, turned former slaves into citizens and granted them equal protection of law. It was radical in 1868 when it was ratified, and has proven to be radical later in American history. When in 1954, Thurgood Marshall, the descendant of slaves, an African-American lawyer, will argue in the Brown v. Board of Education ruling to end segregation in public schools, he'll draw upon the 14th Amendment. The legal infrastructure laid down by the Radical Republicans would later be crucial in the effort to overturn segregation in that Supreme Court decision, Brown v. Board of Education, almost 100 years later, and more recently, the Supreme Court decision, the Obergefell decision, that allows now for same-sex marriage in all 50 states was also based on the 14th Amendment. The lawyers who argued in that case that established same-sex marriage in all states drew upon the 14th Amendment. So the 14th Amendment was radical in 1868, and it has remained radical in the cause of human equality in this nation's history in the 20th and now 21st century. In 1870, the Radical Republicans ratified the 15th Amendment. 15th Amendment says you cannot deny someone the right to vote based on race, which meant now that former slaves who are citizens can vote, the most important marker of citizenship in the 19th century, provided, though, that they are men, because listen carefully. The 15th Amendment says you cannot deny someone the right to vote based on race. That meant you still could deny someone the right to vote based on sex. And so black men could vote, but all women still could not. It will take another amendment much later, 50 years later in American history, the 19th Amendment, that will allow for women to vote. And there is this brief and remarkable moment in the late 1860s, early 1870s, when the 15th Amendment is ratified and enforced, where black men can vote in this country, and they elect other black men to high offices in this country. Former slaves are elected to the U.S. House of Representatives. 14 former slaves, men who were born into slavery, are elected to the U.S. House of Representatives in the Reconstruction period, meaning they walk into the U.S. House of Representatives and vote right alongside men who once owned slaves. That's what was possible now with the radical Republicans amending the Constitution in this way. 14 former slaves are elected to the U.S. House. 2 former slaves will serve as senators from Mississippi. A former slave will briefly serve as governor of Louisiana. So the 15th Amendment sought to grant voting rights, the franchise, to former slaves, granting them the right to vote, the key marker of citizenship in this period. So the radical Republicans come in. They get people angry. They agitate emotion and passion. They reopen the raw wounds of the Civil War. They demand justice and retribution in the face of the very conciliatory approach employed by Andrew Johnson. And they succeed in a dramatic way, amending the Constitution 3 times in just 5 years. It's hard to amend the Constitution. There's a very high threshold. You need 3/4 of the states to agree. That's why today, if you hear people on cable news say, well, we need a constitutional amendment for blah, 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 blah. When you hear that today, laugh at those people because they're full of shit. They don't mean it. It's not going to happen. You need 3/4 of the states to agree to amend the Constitution. You are not going to get 3/4 of the states to agree on anything in America in 2020. We are so divided as a nation. I mean, something as obvious as puppies are cute. There's enough assholes to come along and argue with even that, right? So we're not going to amend the Constitution in any way anytime soon, and yet these guys did it over 5 years, 3 times, in profound ways, ending slavery, granting former slaves citizenship, equal protection of law, allowing black men to vote. Radical Republicans come in, amend the Constitution 3 times in just 5 years, something that seems impossible today. Right now, there's a lot of push for an amendment regarding same-sex marriage. There are people who want to pass an amendment to ban same-sex marriage. There are others who want to pass an amendment to protect same-sex marriage. Quite honestly, I don't really understand all of the emotion and concern about same-sex marriage because, after all, every marriage is a same-sex marriage. Take it from me, after a few years, every night it's pretty much the same sex. But, everyone's getting so excited about this issue. Regardless of how you feel about same-sex marriage, we are not going to get an amendment about that or anything else anytime soon. And yet, these guys were able to amend the Constitution 3 times in 5 years. I wish that was the end of the story, not only because this would be a very short lecture and you can go off to something more worthwhile, but moreover, I wish this was the end of the story because it would mean that with the radical Republicans and their efforts, America had now become a nation of freedom and equality for all. But that's not what happens. Instead, in the decade that follows the ratification of the 15th Amendment, the 1870s, all 3 branches of the federal government will turn their backs on the promise of equality and freedom for all. All 3 branches of the federal government will fail to enforce these amendments, making America a nation of equality and freedom for all. And instead, what we'll see beginning in the 1870s is the betrayal of that promise and hope, and the door opening to 100 years after the Civil War of racism, segregation, apartheid, Jim Crow America. Radical Republicans had their moment, but sadly it would be just a moment, because in the decade that followed their efforts, in the 1870s, the 3 branches of the federal government will turn their backs on the effort and promise to make equality and freedom real. Let's take these three branches of the federal government one by one and explain how that happens, this betrayal of Reconstruction's promise. Let's start with the legislative branch, Congress, the U.S. House and the U.S. Senate. Now, that's where the radical Republicans were based. As I introduced them to you, they were senators and congressmen, men like Thaddeus Stevens. Well, what happens is that branch, the legislative branch, turns its back on Reconstruction for a couple of reasons. One, some radical Republicans died in office. Thaddeus Stevens dies in 1868. He doesn't ever live to see the 15th Amendment. Other radical Republicans were voted out of office and replaced by new congressmen and new senators who were not lifelong abolitionists, who weren't dedicated to the cause of freedom and equality. So part of the reason why the legislative branch turns its back on the promise of equality and freedom for all is simply a change in personnel. There were fewer and fewer radical Republicans in Congress. They died in office, or they were voted out or retired and replaced by a new generation of congressmen and senators who were not advocates of continuing this effort towards civil rights and equality for African Americans. But the main reason why the legislative branch turns its back on the promise of equality and freedom for all is that what made the radical Republicans powerful ultimately led to their demise. What made the radical Republicans powerful? Passion, emotion. They were the congressmen, senators who gave these powerful, passionate, thunderous speeches demanding change, demanding retribution. They would take to the floor of the U.S. Senate and the U.S. Congress and whip up emotion and frenzy and passion in this crusade for radically remaking the South. Well, passion is powerful, and it can motivate you in that moment. But passion is inherently temporary. It fades, it wanes. And that's what happens here among the few radical Republicans remaining in the Senate and the House. It became harder and harder to get people excited and passionate because passion fades, it wanes. Perhaps you've had this moment where, back when we were still going to campus, you would get out of class, it's a Friday, you're looking forward to the weekend, you get in your car, you're rocking out to your tunes there in your car, you've got one of these, vanilla bullshit things or whatever you guys are all drinking, a frappe or whatever the hell it is, in the cup holder. And as you exit the parking lot of campus, ready to enjoy your newfound freedom, someone cuts you off, you slam on the brakes, the frappe goes flying, frappe, right? You are pissed, you are angry. If you could, you'd reach into that other car and beat the hell out of that driver, right? You are angry as can be. But then a week goes by, and you see that same car on campus, and you roll down your window and you flip them off because that's your duty as a Southern California motorist, but you're no longer willing to commit bodily harm. Why? Because the passion faded. Or maybe this is a more salient example to those of you in the class. Who among us hasn't at some point in our lives stared into someone's eyes and said, "I love you, we're going to be together forever." And then a month later you delete their phone number, right? Where did the love go? Where it always goes. Passion, emotion fades. It became harder and harder to convince congressmen and senators to continue this effort to create equality and freedom in the South. People said, we did it. We passed those amendments. Let's move on. The passion and emotion that made the radical Republicans possible ultimately waned, helping to explain why the legislative branch turns its back on the promise of equality and freedom for all into the 1870s and beyond. And then you have the executive branch, the presidency. Andrew Johnson did his best to try to stop the radical Republicans. He did his best to try to undermine the passage of the 14th Amendment. He went around the South and gave these very racist speeches where he employed the language of racism to get whites in the South angry in an effort to stop the 14th Amendment. This led to race riots all throughout the South where blacks were beaten and killed by these angry white mobs who had been agitated by the president. Now, I know it's quite a shock to you that we might have had in our history a president who would openly incite violence through racist rhetoric. Use your imagination to imagine such a strange and different time. So Johnson was trying to stop the radical Republicans, and as a result of this, they impeached his ass. It used to be if you went to Andrew Johnson's birthplace, you would see a plaque that would say, Andrew Johnson, the only president ever impeached in American history. And then Bill Clinton got that blowjob, and they had to erase only and put first, because in the 1990s, Bill Clinton became the second president to be impeached. Now, as we've seen in the last few months, we've had our third president impeached, but the second to be impeached was Bill Clinton. And he was impeached because, now I know this is very hard for all of us to revisit this very terrible time in our nation's history. He was impeached because he lied about a blowjob in a civil deposition. I know. How did the Republic survive? When Clinton was impeached in the 1990s, it was never close as to whether or not he would be removed from office. As we've all now learned in the last few months, when you're impeached, it doesn't mean you're kicked out of office. It means you're put on trial to see whether or not you deserve to be kicked out of office. When Clinton was impeached in the 1990s, the Republicans who impeached him never had the votes to remove him, and he stayed in office by a very wide margin. And in fact, the Republicans did him a favor because he was even more popular after impeachment. People said, well, let's see, he cheats on his wife, he plays the saxophone, he's kind of like my uncle, right? You know, people liked him more. When Andrew Johnson was impeached, he too survived. He was not removed from office. We have never had a president actually removed from office. Nixon resigned before he was likely to be removed from office. So Johnson also survives, like Clinton and later Trump. But when Johnson was voted upon by the Senate in regards to whether to remove him, he survived by one vote. And that one vote was only secured by bribing that senator into voting. So it was very clear to Johnson that he had lost control of this effort, that he was impeached, almost removed from office, and so as a result, he kept his mouth shut for the rest of Lincoln's second term. He was basically neutralized as a political force, and that allowed the radical Republicans to continue with their agenda. In 1868, Ulysses S. Grant was elected president. War hero, general, the man who helped win the Civil War and salvage victory after it looked like the Union was going to be defeated. We have a long history of electing generals and war heroes. Grant's part of that, but of course he was also extremely popular for his ability to win the Civil War. Grant was an ally of the radical Republicans. He believed in their agenda. He believed in this effort to create equality for African Americans in the South. He helped shepherd through the 15th Amendment, which was ratified when he was president. And in his first term, he was really successful in this cause. He successfully warred against the KKK. He called them what they are, a terrorist organization. He called out the army, arrested their leaders, and scared the shit out of the rest of them into going underground. He basically neutralized the Klan when it first developed right after the surrender of the Confederacy. So in his first term, Grant was a great ally of the radical Republicans, a true believer, an advocate for racial equality, and a man who worked hard to help destroy the Klan and create true equality for African Americans. But Grant would struggle in his second term. He was reelected in 1872, and in his second term, his administration would be mired in scandal. There were a number of scandals involving his cabinet that seemed to indicate that the Grant administration was corrupt. Now, Grant himself was never implicated in any of this illegality or malfeasance, and that has stood the test of time, where today most historians argue Grant was completely innocent of any of the illegality and scandal that surrounded his administration. But when members of your cabinet are revealed to be thieves, well, that does ultimately bear upon the president. When you're surrounded by thieves, you bear the taint of those thieves. And so people saw the Grant administration in its second term as corrupt, and this is crucial here. It's crucial in explaining why you have this failed opportunity beginning in the 1870s to secure liberty and equality for all, because one of the lessons to take away from this class, one of the lessons to take away from any sober, serious study of U.S. history is that the cause of civil rights only goes forward when the federal government makes it go forward. The story of civil rights is not the story of one day every white person in America waking up and saying, you know what, blacks and whites should be equal. No, it's not about changing hearts and minds. It's about the federal government forcing states and individuals to do what they are not inclined to do, treat blacks and whites as equals. In the modern civil rights movements of the 1950s and 1960s, change comes from the federal government through Supreme Court decisions like Brown v. Board of Education, which mandates that in all 50 states, schools desegregate. When southern states resisted, Dwight Eisenhower, the president, had to call in the 101st Airborne paratroopers at gunpoint to open up a public high school in Little Rock, Arkansas. That's what it took. So civil rights only goes forward when the federal government forces that change. It's not about changing hearts and minds. It's about the federal government saying you will open up your doors to all students today. So you need the federal government. Story of civil rights, story of big government. Keep that in mind the next time you hear someone rail against big government. Well, you wouldn't have civil rights without big government. And that's crucial here to the Grant administration, because when the Grant administration was seen as corrupt, people didn't want more government. They don't want their government doing more if they thought their government was filled with thieves. Another problem for Grant in his second term was a massive depression, which began in 1873. It's known as the Panic of 1873. And this also ebbed support for civil rights, for racial equality. People were concerned about jobs, unemployment, and so they said, why are we so worried about whether or not blacks can vote in the South? Why are we so worried about civil rights when we have bigger issues? So Grant was a great president in the cause of civil rights in his first term. In his second term, he faced scandals that worked against support for the federal government in an interventionist role and a debilitating depression. In 1876, a president was elected that we all admire. You know, you get his birthday off. He's on our currency. I'm talking about that great president, Rutherford B. Hayes, right? Him? What? You never heard of him? Yeah, that's kind of the point. Hayes would be sworn in 1877. 1877, as I noted in the very first slide of this lecture, is the end date of Reconstruction. Hayes comes in, and he withdraws all the troops out of the South, all the federal troops, basically allowing southern states to do whatever the hell they want. And he would be the first of a series of presidents following him who we all forget about. We had presidents in the 1870s and 1880s like James Garfield, Chester Arthur, Benjamin Harrison. Ever heard of these guys? Yeah. You don't get their birthday off. They're not on our currency. Grover Cleveland. We elected a guy named Grover twice. A series of do-nothing, worthless presidents who are not remembered. And that's tragic because they didn't do anything in the cause of civil rights. So starting with Hayes and continuing for many, many decades, the executive branch would fail to do anything effectively. And that's, again, crucial because if civil rights are to be protected in this country, you need the federal government. And then you have the judicial branch, Supreme Court, which will make a series of rulings in the 1870s that effectively take the teeth out, the enforcement arm of those amendments, the 14th and 15th Amendments. You might ask, Professor Hawkins, if we had a 14th and 15th Amendment in the 1860s and 1870s, why did we need a modern civil rights movement in the 1950s and 1960s? Why were people being bludgeoned and killed in Selma and Birmingham for the right to vote if we had passed an amendment in 1870 granting the right to vote? Well, the reason is that in the decades that follow the Radical Republicans' efforts, the federal government turned its back on enforcing those amendments. And part of that was the way in which the Supreme Court, in a series of rulings in the 1870s, issued rulings that made it effectively impossible to enforce equal protection of law and voting rights for all Americans. And the capper to this was the Plessy versus Ferguson ruling of 1896. Now, officially outside the temporal boundaries of Reconstruction, Reconstruction ends in 1877 when our hero, Rutherford B. Hayes, takes the troops out of the South. So Plessy versus Ferguson is outside those temporal boundaries of Reconstruction, but it's perfectly consistent with the Supreme Court rulings during Reconstruction that undermined equality and freedom for all. This case involved an African-American man named Homer Plessy, who bought a train ticket for a railroad in Louisiana. He paid full price, the same price that everyone paid, and as a result, he believed he had a right to sit wherever he pleased. He sat down in the white-only section of this segregated railroad car. He was told to give up his seat and move to the colored, that was the term, it's offensive to our ears today, but that was the term used, section of the railroad. He refused, he was arrested, and ultimately his case went before the U.S. Supreme Court in 1896. Has anyone heard a similar story in American history of an African American who sat down wherever he or she pleased and was arrested for refusing to abide second-class status? You're likely thinking of Rosa Parks. And the reason why Rosa Parks will be arrested in 1955, basically 60 years later, is because of what the Supreme Court said in 1896. In this ruling, the Plessy versus Ferguson ruling, the Supreme Court said it was perfectly legal, perfectly constitutional to segregate based on race in American life, opening the door to another 60 years of apartheid, Jim Crow, segregation until brave Americans like Rosa Parks come along and break the law in the name of a higher law. What Plessy versus Ferguson did was give federal sanction to Jim Crow apartheid segregation. What was the goal of Win the Peace? Keeping blacks and whites separate. What did the Supreme Court say in 1896? Go right ahead, opening the door to another 60 years of apartheid in this nation. So the radical Republicans had their moment, but it was sadly but a moment, because in the decade that followed, the federal government, which is so crucial and necessary to securing civil rights for all, forcing states and individuals to do what they're not inclined to do, treat all as equal, will turn its back on that promise of equality for all, the legislative, the executive, and the judicial branches. What was the fate for African Americans when those early opportunities and promises faded, when Reconstruction began with such hope, with the radical Republicans taking the reins and steering the nation towards equality? What happens now for African Americans when those promises fade and the federal government turns its back on Reconstruction? Well, I noted earlier that former slaves never received 40 acres of land. Those who had during the war would actually see the same federal government that granted them that land come back and repossess it and give it to traders, give it to ex-Confederates. So former slaves never received those 40 acres of land. That again is a debt that has still not been paid. There were laws passed in southern states once they were granted free license and allowed to do as they please when the federal government withdraws from the South. Laws were passed in those southern states that made it impossible for African Americans to work in most occupations. A free labor system does not prevail in the South after the Civil War. The great hope of Northerners that now everyone will be part of a wage labor economy doesn't happen, because laws were passed in southern states that forbid African Americans from working as laborers. So they couldn't work for wages, they didn't have land, and as a result the only way to feed themselves and their family was to enter into a new labor system known as sharecropping. Sharecropping involved an African American family working, effectively renting the land of a white Southerner who, in the early Reconstruction period, likely was an ex-Confederate, someone who had participated in the Confederacy. The sharecropper would do all the labor on that land, plant the seeds, pull weeds, and then ultimately harvest the crop and sell that crop for profit. The bulk of the profits went to the landowner. It's his land, and a small share, hence the term sharecropping, went to the sharecropper and his family. What was that share? Well, historians smarter than I have crunched the numbers, and they tell us that the average annual income for a sharecropping family in the 1880s was $79 a year. What sharecropping did was it locked African Americans into a debilitating cycle of poverty and indebtedness and preserved land rights, power, and prosperity for ex-Confederates, white Southerners, many of whom had been complicit and involved in traitorous actions against this nation. In sharecropping, the books were all held by the landowner. So once a year you went to settle up with the landowner and he'd say, well, look at my books here, and I've done the calculations, and guess what? You owe me money. So the next year you started already in debt. So sharecropping was a trick. It was a ruse. It was a work that was designed to lock African Americans onto land as a captive labor force, and it ultimately locked them into a prevailing cycle of poverty, indebtedness for decades to come. Win the peace, right? Keeping power, privileges in the hands of whites only. You might say, well, wait a minute, Professor Hawkins. You said there's this period where black men can vote and former slaves are elected to the U.S. House and the U.S. Senate. Why aren't they working to change this? Well, as part of the Win the Peace agenda, there's this effort to deny black men the right to vote in Reconstruction and beyond. Now, you couldn't pass a law that said black men can't vote. That would be unconstitutional because, again, the 15th Amendment says you cannot deny someone the right to vote based on race. So what happens is that states use other means to prevent African Americans from voting, like literacy tests. Literacy tests have been used throughout human history to stop poor people from voting. In order to vote, you got to prove you can read and write. Well, as we learned, prior to the Civil War, it was a crime to teach a slave to read and write in most of the South. The emancipated population of 4 million slaves in 1865 are 95% illiterate. Then after the Civil War, there's this deliberate effort to prevent the creation of public schools for African Americans so that their children also would be locked into a perpetual state of illiteracy. So, couldn't pass literacy tests, couldn't vote. Another mechanism that was used to get around the 15th Amendment and prevent blacks from voting, poll taxes. These two have been used throughout human history to prevent poor people from voting. You want to vote, you got to pay a tax. That's what a poll tax is. You got to pay a fee, pay a fine, pay a tax in order to vote. Well, if you're making $79 a year, you don't have a few extra dollars to pay for the privilege of voting. If your children are starving and dying in your arms, the infant mortality rate for sharecroppers in the late 19th century was 1 in 2. Half of all children born to you will not live to see their second birthday because of malnutrition and starvation. So poll taxes were very effective in preventing poor sharecroppers from voting. But the problem with literacy tests and poll taxes was that, yeah, they stopped a lot of poor blacks from voting, but they also stopped a lot of poor whites from voting. A lot of poor whites in the South couldn't pass the literacy test. A lot of poor whites in the South could not pay the poll tax, and that jeopardizes Win the Peace. Because Win the Peace is about keeping blacks and whites separate, rights, power, and privileges for whites only, no rights, no power, no privileges for African Americans. When poor whites can't vote, they're denied those privileges. And the last thing that power brokers, politicians in the South want is poor blacks and poor whites looking at each other and saying, hell, we're both getting screwed here. That opens the door to a class-based society, a class solidarity among poor people. So the solution to that problem came with understanding clauses. These were in place in southern states and many southwestern states for decades and decades and decades after Reconstruction. In order to vote, in such states that had understanding clauses, you had to prove that you understand the issues at stake. So a poll worker would ask you a series of questions to see whether or not you understand. If you're an African American man who showed up and was given these questions and you answered them perfectly, I mean A+ answers, and then quoted word for word the state constitution of Louisiana, Alabama, whatever state it was, it didn't matter. Poll worker would look at the color of your skin, see that's black, and say, I'm sorry, you don't understand and you won't be voting today. Any old white hillbilly who shows up with 2 or 3 teeth rattling around in their head and is given the exact same questions and replies blah, 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 blah. Poll worker look at the color of his skin, see that it's white, and say, Bo Cephas, you clearly understand. Come on in and vote. What understanding clauses were simply an elaborate screening process that allowed all whites to vote while denying all blacks to vote. And if any black man said, wait a minute, I know my rights, I will be voting today, also at polling stations were the Klan and other white supremacist groups who were more than willing to use violence, terrorism, and intimidation to prevent African Americans from seeking their constitutional rights. Slavery was only possible through terrorism and violence. Maintaining what slavery allowed for in a post-slavery America also mandated violence and terrorism. In the late 19th and the early 20th century, African Americans do not have freedom over their very bodies. They are frequently lynched in public, seized, and killed. In the early 20th century, that was a form of popular entertainment. People would actually go and watch another human being killed in public for fun. I don't recommend you do this. We got enough to worry about right now. It's hard enough to survive mentally right now at this moment, but you can do this if you are inclined. A quick Google search will pull up photographs of public lynchings in the early 20th century where people are grinning as they're getting their photograph taken in front of a corpse hanging from a tree that has been mutilated, where the genitals have been ripped off for both men and women who are lynched. They're posing their children in front of it like it's a Kodak moment, something to put in the family album. That's what happened in this country for decades after slavery. Over 4,000 people were lynched in the late 19th, early 20th century. So African Americans in the decades after Reconstruction didn't even have freedom over their very bodies and persons. And then we think about what that might mean today and the continuing way in which black bodies seem to be quite often killed in public. Anyone seen this video that's circulating of that murder most recently, this last week? You can hear those echoes even now in the 21st century. So African Americans saw the great hope and promise in April of 1865 with the end of slavery and a new America reborn, but sadly, tragically, as we've learned now, beginning in the 1870s, when the federal government fails to fulfill its necessary role protecting equality and freedom for all and turns its back on that, this is what you get: sharecropping, a denial of voting rights, violence, all in that effort to win the peace. Big theme of this class is that American history is an argument without end. The story I have for you this term is not the story of everyone getting together, holding hands, and singing Kumbaya. The story of American history I have for you this term is not about consensus, how Americans have always rallied around common ideals. The contemporary reality we live in today, where Americans are so divided, where argument, debate is the norm, is deeply rooted in our history. America is an argument without end about fundamental questions like, who is an American? What does it mean to be free? What defines this nation? Those are the very debates we're having right now, and they're the debates we've always had. Reconstruction was one beat in that longer rhythm, where the argument was, what sort of nation will we become? One that finally fulfills its promise of equality and freedom for all, lives up to those Lockean ideals of a transcendent human condition where all are created equal and all are endowed with natural rights? Or are we going to be a nation of rights for some? Certainly, as we've now seen in our latter slides here, of the two, when the peace has prevailed. In 1877, when Reconstruction ends, we are not a nation of freedom and equality for all. Instead, we become, once again, a race-based society, a win the peace society of rights, power, and privileges for some. But because American history is an argument without end, this is not the end of the story. Going forward beyond Reconstruction, brave Americans like Rosa Parks and Fred Korematsu and Dolores Huerta will come along and say, I'm an American too. I too deserve to be free. And challenge this order, demanding instead a new America that finally fulfills this promise.